Close your eyes for a moment and think back on your life. Think about the things and the experiences that have just delighted you. Things you've enjoyed, things you've been thrilled with. Okay, got that feeling? Now, think back on things that irritated you. Things that made you angry. Things that made you sad. Now, have you had a challenge trying to communicate those things to people who know you? It can be a challenge because even though we have a lot in common, each of us experiences things a little bit differently. Now, imagine trying to communicate those things to a slug. Why are you laughing? The gap between us and a slug is huge. They simply aren't equipped to understand what it means to have all the experiences that you and I have had. The gap between us and God is infinitely larger. And he gave himself this challenge: how to come to people with the spiritual capacity of slugs and communicate to them what God is like. That wasn't very complimentary to us, was it? The fact is, in our natural state, we are spiritually like slugs. We're dead. We are in enmity with God. Part of the purpose for Jesus' earthly ministry was not only to show what God would look like if he came in the flesh, but also to communicate what God is really like to people who didn't care, people were hostile to God, and perhaps most difficult, people who thought they already knew what God was like. All throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus makes several statements about himself, often called the I am statements of Jesus. He would take an image that people were very familiar with: water, bread, sheep, and compare himself to those things spiritually. Showed how he is water to people who are spiritually thirsty, bread to people who are spiritually hungry, guidance and protection for people who are lost and afflicted. He would be all those things for people who recognized that they needed him. And that's a bit of what is going on in John chapter 8. This is, as we saw in chapter 7, the setting is in the temple, the festival of tabernacles, what sometimes is called the festival of booths, not booze, booths. This is a week-long party, essentially, where people come to celebrate and remind themselves of how God led them through the Sinai desert, living in tents, being provided for 40 years. That pillar of fire by night. And so to commemorate that, the Jews would hold this special celebration. As the daylight fell, these 4 large candelabra would be lit, along with 4 pots of oil that were lit, and the entire temple would be aglow. People would be praising, they would be singing the songs that they had been raised with, they would do dances together to commemorate the God who led them through all that desert all those years ago. And it was in the middle of this context that Jesus said something that absolutely stunned the people. He said to them, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus, at this point, is challenging them to take that tradition and set it aside, because at this point it is simply a dead tradition, a memorial to a time in the past. He is now here. He is the light that can be in a living relationship with them. We can sometimes get trapped in that problem of holding on to traditions that are no longer keeping us in touch with God. Jesus wants us to maintain that relationship with Him that doesn't depend on traditions that have died. If the tradition is keeping us close to Him, it's worth hanging on to. But if it's not, it's preventing us from that relationship with Him. Along with that problem, the dead tradition, there is another problem that comes to us from our culture. And it is something that is so insidious that we oftentimes don't even realize we have the problem. The idea is that there really aren't any absolutes. Everything depends on your point of view. In our culture today, Americans tend to be obsessed with spirituality, but they're not quite as obsessed with finding truth. I don't know how many of you watched the Golden Globe Awards, but Oprah Winfrey had an inspiring and compelling message that I thought hit the nail on the head in a lot of ways, but there was one phrase she used that troubled me a lot. She used the phrase, "my truth." She's known for that phrase and for teaching the idea that I am essentially the final decider of what is good and right for me. My truth. Now, I don't have the right to tell you what's good and right for you. You've got to find it for yourself. But then you don't have the right to tell me what's good and right for me. I have to find it for myself. And I wonder if anyone has ever been wise enough to actually do that. To find what's good and right, not just for me, but what is actually good and right. Jesus didn't think anyone was wise enough, and that's the reason He pointed to Himself. I have a GPS. For years before I had that one, it was hit or miss whether I would actually find your house. Now, the only time I have difficulty is on new streets. I discovered when I drove to the east end of Lebanon, past the Wells Fargo Bank, toward the Giant, the street that the GPS lists is no longer there. That amazing bit of technology is only as good as the data it contains. And if it doesn't have correct data, it's not going to give me correct information. My daughter and I are in negotiations whether I should try to update it or buy a new one. We're not sure which is less expensive. Trying to find good and right, trying to find truth based on ourselves is like that GPS. If you've got bad information coming in, you're going to wind up going in a bad direction. In the story, The Kingdom of Ice, journalist Hampton Sides describes the account of the failed 19th century polar expedition of the USS Jeannette. The captain, George DeLong, had received maps based on the work of someone named Dr. August Heinrich Petermann. Petermann insisted that the maps had a thermocentric gateway through the ice that opened onto a vast polar sea on the top of the world, a fair weather passage beyond all the ice. The Jeannette was staking its future on the hope that they could get through and get to that open area that was free of ice. It turned out that no such open area exists, and the Jeannette was trapped in the ice. And they had to suddenly come to the realization that what they were hoping for wasn't the case, and they had to deal with the reality. This ice is going to kill us if we keep trying to follow this map that isn't right. Far too often our culture will tell us, figure it out for yourself, do what makes you happy, do what keeps you content, just don't hurt anybody. It's a faulty map. And so Jesus has told us, instead, to look to him as light, accurate information about how life works best. The world desperately needs to see people who have found the accurate map and are following it instead of trading it for what's convenient and comfortable. I do have one word of caution for us. Jesus has called us to be disciples and in turn to make disciples. Being about the work of being a disciple and making a disciple does not mean becoming an inspiration junkie. Do you know what I mean by that? Finding the latest bestseller that makes you feel thrilled. Going to that speaker who always gives you a high. Trying to find the thing that will make you feel good today. That's the life of an inspiration junkie. And the difficulty is when things get very, very, very difficult. They don't have the wherewithal to keep following Jesus as he would have them to. Because of who he is, Jesus is the one who can shed light on how to be the kind of disciple that's able to follow him even when it's tough. It doesn't begin by screwing up your courage and saying, I'm going to do this no matter what. It begins with that relationship with him. You heard about the man who asked a mail order company to send plans for a birdhouse. Instead of sending him plans for the birdhouse, they sent him plans for a sailboat. He tried to put it together, but it just wouldn't work, and he couldn't figure out what kind of bird was going to live in this dumb birdhouse. So he wrote a letter and sent all the parts back to the people. They wrote a letter of apology and added this postscript. If you think it was tough for you, you should have seen the man who got your plans trying to sail a birdhouse. A lot of people are trying to operate on Christian plans, trying to do the Christian thing, but they don't have that relationship with Jesus. That is the empowerment. And so make sure you know him before you try to apply these plans. The challenge for us is to get to know Jesus as he really is, not just the way we think he probably is, not just the way we hope he is, but the way he in fact is. And to let that relationship affect us in what we say and what we do. Will you pray with me?